off noticeably. The single-stage superchargers of the Jumo 211B were simply not optimized for the high-altitude arena where it would need to engage British fighters. This was a critical tribulation. A heavy fighter that could not compete at altitude was a compromised weapon from the outset. Furthermore, the aerodynamic drag of the new nose, while streamlined, was not zero. At high speeds, this additional drag, combined with the increased weight, conspired to reduce the maximum speed and, more importantly, the acceleration, a vital metric for a fighter needing to gain or shed energy rapidly in a combat situation. The most crucial trials involved testing the very reason for its existence: its firepower. Before live ammunition was used, the aircraft would have undergone rigorous gun harmonization tests. This involved aligning the convergence point of the three MG-17 machine guns, and later the mixed battery of MG-17s and the MG-FF cannon, at a specific range, typically between 300 and 400 meters. The pilot would make high-speed passes on a ground target, testing the gun sights and the stability of the platform during firing. The first burst of fire from the nose-mounted weapons would have been a violent event. The recoil of the guns, especially the potent 20mm cannon, imparted significant forces on the airframe. Engineers monitored for any vibration or structural flexing that could throw off the aim or, worse, threaten the integrity of the nose section. The sealed bomb bay, now acting as an ammunition bay, required checks to ensure the feed mechanisms functioned flawlessly under high-G maneuvers and that fumes from spent cartridges did not seep into the crew compartment. These initial flights revealed a machine of contradictions. It was stable yet heavy, powerful yet insufficiently so, formidably armed yet partially blind. The trials confirmed that the basic concept was sound. The Ju-88 airframe could indeed be weaponized into a stable gun platform, but the tribulations highlighted that it was not a wonder weapon. It would not outperform dedicated single-engine fighters. Its success would depend entirely on the development of tactics that played to its strengths: its heavy firepower, its ruggedness, and its range. The initial flight test data provided a sobering blueprint for its future. It was not the flawless Predator some might have hoped for, but a specialized tool born from necessity, whose effectiveness would be determined not by its ability to win a dogfight, but by its capacity to fulfill the specific and increasingly desperate doctrinal need for a long-range, hard-hitting escort and interceptor. The first flight was not an end, but a beginning, the start of a long and difficult process of refining a promising but troubled prototype into a weapon of war. The creation of the Junkers Ju-88C cannot be understood merely as a technical exercise in airframe modification. It was the physical manifestation of a specific and ultimately fraught aerial warfare doctrine, the Zerstörer or destroyer concept. This doctrine, which germinated in the theoretical soil of the interwar years and reached its operational zenith and subsequent crisis in the early stages of World War II, represented a bold but fundamentally flawed vision of strategic air combat. The Ju-88C was not an isolated experiment but rather the second-generation embodiment of this idea, an attempt to rectify the catastrophic failures of its predecessor, the Messerschmitt Bf 110, and salvage the core philosophy of the long-range heavy fighter. The intellectual origins of the Zerstörer concept lay in the desire to break the tactical tyranny of range that limited the effectiveness of single-engine fighters. In the mid-1930s, air power theorists within the nascent Luftwaffe envisioned a future war where bomber formations would strike deep into enemy territory. The brilliant but short-ranged Bf 109 could not escort them on these long-range missions. The solution was a Fernjäger, a long-range fighter, a category that evolved into the more aggressive-sounding Zerstörer. This aircraft would be a strategic weapon in its own right. Its mission was multifaceted and ambitious. First, to conduct long-range offensive patrols, sweeping the skies of enemy aircraft ahead of the bomber streams. Second, to provide close escort to the bombers themselves, forming a protective shield. And third, to use its speed and range for tactical reconnaissance and ground attack missions. It was to be autonomous, powerful, and capable of defeating any enemy aircraft it encountered. The Messerschmitt Bf 110 was designed to fulfill this doctrine. It was a sleek, twin-engine aircraft with heavy forward-firing armament, typically two 20mm cannons and four 7.92mm machine guns, and a rear gunner for defense. On paper and in the early campaigns against Poland and France, it appeared to be a success. It was fast, well-armed, and operated with impunity against disorganized and obsolete opposition. The Luftwaffe High Command, particularly Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, developed an almost unshakable faith in the invincibility of his Zerstörer. This faith was obliterated during the Battle of Britain. When the Bf-110 met the modern, integrated air defense network of the Royal Air Force, the entire Zerstör doctrine was subjected to a brutal and unforgiving audit. The aircraft's shortcomings were ruthlessly exposed. It was not the agile dogfighter it needed to be. Against the nimble Hurricanes and, especially, the Spitfires, the Bf-110 was a lumbering target. Its large wingspan and twin-engine weight made it sluggish in a turn, and its acceleration was insufficient to disengage from a fight. The myth of the self-defending formation was shattered. The destroyers themselves required protection from the very Bf-109s they were meant to relieve. The failure was doctrinal as much as it was technical. The core idea that a heavy, multi-role aircraft could consistently outperform dedicated single-engine interceptors in their own optimal environment was proven catastrophically wrong. It was from the wreckage of this doctrinal failure that the revised role for the Ju-88C emerged. The Luftwaffe could not abandon the Zerstör concept entirely. The strategic need for a long-range escort was more desperate than ever. Instead, the doctrine was pragmatically redefined, moving from strategic autonomy to tactical integration. The new Zerstör would not be a hunter ranging freely ahead of the pack. It would be a bodyguard embedded within the pack itself. This was the doctrinal niche for which the Ju-88C was conceived. Its role was no longer to seek and destroy enemy fighters in sweeping maneuvers, but to act as a flying fortress within the bomber stream, flying amidst the Heinkels, Dorniers, and other Ju-88s. The Ju-88C's formidable forward firepower would create a lethal zone around the formation. Any enemy fighter attempting to make a head-on or beam attack on a bomber would be forced to fly through a gauntlet of concentrated 20mm cannon and machine gun fire. The Ju-88C's rugged airframe could absorb more damage than a Bf-110, and its own defensive rear gunner provided a measure of protection. The doctrine shifted from offensive counter-air to defensive escort, from dueling to area denial. This revised doctrine also acknowledged the Ju-88C's limitations. It was not expected to tangle with Spitfires in a turning fight. Its tactics would be based on energy and firepower. In a boom-and-zoom attack, it could use its dive speed to make a single, slashing pass through an enemy formation, relying on its heavy armament to score a kill before using its momentum to extend away and climb for another attempt. Its stability also made it an ideal platform for night fighting, a role where its limitations in daytime visual acuity were nullified by the darkness, and its ability to carry early radar sets and heavy, upward-firing cannon, Schragemusik, came to the fore. Thus, the Ju-88C became the vessel for a more mature, if less glamorous, Zerstör doctrine. It was a doctrine born of painful experience, one that traded the ambitious vision of a strategic destroyer for the pragmatic reality of a tactical defender. It accepted that the heavy fighter could not be all things to all missions. Instead, it was specialized, its role defined by the strengths of its airframe, ruggedness, firepower, and range, rather than by the failed promise of dogfighting superiority. The Ju-88C did not save the Zerstör concept in its original form. It instead redefined it, creating a new, more sustainable doctrine that would allow the heavy fighter to remain a relevant, if specialized, weapon in the Luftwaffe's arsenal for the remainder of the war. The Junkers Ju-88C V1, and the subsequent production models that followed, existed in a state of perpetual compromise. It was an aircraft defined not by a singular excellence, but by a calculated balance of formidable strengths and profound limitations. Its performance profile was a direct reflection of its origins as a converted bomber, creating a weapons system that was exceptionally capable in specific, narrow mission sets while being dangerously vulnerable in others. A clear-eyed analysis of its capabilities reveals why it could never be the universal Zerstör the Luftwaffe initially dreamed of, but also why it evolved into a highly effective and enduring specialist. Strengths: the foundation of a niche. The most significant strength of the Ju-88C was its formidable forward-firing armament. The standard fit of one 20mm MGFF cannon and three 7.92mm MG-17 machine guns provided a concentration of firepower that could dismantle an enemy bomber in a single, well-aimed burst. This gave it a first-pass kill potential that single-engine fighters, with their rifle-caliber machine guns, often lacked. In its intended role as a bomber-destroyer and formation defender, this was its raison d'etre. The sheer volume of fire, combined with the destructive power of the 20mm mine shell, created a lethal deterrent for any enemy pilot considering a head-on attack on a German bomber stream. A second critical strength was its ruggedness and structural integrity. Inherited from its bomber lineage, the The Ju-88 airframe was renowned for its ability to absorb battle damage and remain flyable. This was a qualitative advantage over the more lightly built Bf-110. For a heavy fighter expected to fly through defensive fire from enemy bombers and engage in combat, this durability was a key survivability feature. It could take hits and bring its crew home, a factor that bred confidence in its aircrews. Thirdly, the aircraft possessed excellent range and endurance. Compared to the short-legged Bf-109, the Ju-88C could penetrate deep into enemy airspace and remain on station for extended periods. This made it the only viable platform for providing meaningful escort to bomber formations on long-range missions, a capability the Luftwaffe desperately lacked. This endurance also made it a natural candidate for the Vernac-jagged, long-range night fighter role later in the war, where it could loiter for hours in suspected bomber streams. Finally, its straight-line speed, while degraded from the bomber variant, remained respectable, especially at medium altitudes. It was faster than the Bf-110 and most contemporary bombers. This speed was not for dogfighting, but for the zoom phase of the boom and zoom tactic. It allowed the Ju-88C to disengage from an unfavorable situation and use its speed in level flight to escape more nimble opponents that could outturn it. Limitations. The price of conversion. The primary and most debilitating limitation of the Ju-88C was its lack of maneuverability and agility. It was a heavy aircraft and its controls were accordingly heavy. Its turn radius was wide, and its rate of roll was sluggish. In a turning engagement with a Spitfire or Hurricane, it was almost helpless. The enemy fighter could easily stay inside its turn, negating its formidable forward armament. This fundamental lack of agility dictated a highly disciplined tactical doctrine. It had to avoid turning fights at all costs. Closely linked to its weight was its performance penalty. The conversion from bomber to fighter added significant mass, from the solid nose, the armor, and the increased ammunition, without a corresponding increase in engine power. The Jumo 211B1 engines, producing around 1,200 horsepower each, were adequate but not exceptional. The result was a climb rate that was inferior to both single-engine fighters and the Bf-110. Its time to altitude was poor, a critical failing for an interceptor. Furthermore, its performance at high altitude was severely hampered by the medium-altitude optimization of the Jumo 211's single-stage supercharger. Above 5,000 meters, its power dropped off sharply, placing it at a distinct disadvantage in the high-altitude battles favored by the RAF. Another significant operational limitation was the pilot's external visibility. The replacement of the glazed bomber nose with a solid metal one created massive blind spots directly ahead and below the aircraft. This was a catastrophic handicap in a fighter pilot, for whom seeing the enemy first was half the battle. It made formation flying more challenging, complicated landing and taxiing, and meant an adversary could easily disappear from view during a combat maneuver, only to reappear in a lethal firing position. The aircraft's defensive armament, while a necessary concession, was also a limitation. A single, handheld 7.92mm machine gun in the rear cockpit was woefully inadequate against a determined fighter attack from the rear. It offered a psychological deterrent more than a physical one. A skilled attacker could easily overcome it, knowing that the Ju-88C's primary defense, its forward firepower, was useless in this scenario. Finally, the size of the aircraft was a double-edged sword. While it provided space for radar operators and equipment in the night fighter role, it also made the Ju-88C larger, easier to see, and easier to hit target than a single-engine fighter. Its large wing area and twin-engine configuration presented a vulnerable surface area, and the liquid-cooled engines, with their critical radiators, were susceptible to damage from even small arms fire. The balanced verdict. The performance analysis of the Ju-88C paints a picture of a highly specialized tool. It was not a general-purpose fighter. Its strengths, firepower, ruggedness, and range were maximized in specific conditions, defending bomber boxes, making slashing attacks on enemy bombers, or operating at night. Its limitations, poor maneuverability, mediocre climb rate, and bad visibility, made it a liability in the daytime fighter-versus-fighter arena. Its success was entirely dependent on the strict application of tactics that played to its strengths while meticulously avoiding situations that exploited its weaknesses. It was a weapon of opportunity and doctrine, not of universal air superiority, and its historical legacy is defined by this very dichotomy. The theoretical debates, design compromises, and flight test data surrounding the Junkers Ju-88C were rendered moot the moment the aircraft was committed to its first operational missions. Its true evaluation would not come from engineers at Dessau, but from combat pilots over the English Channel and the North Sea, facing the determined opposition of the Royal Air Force. The early operational deployment of the Ju-88C, beginning in the latter half of 1940, thrust the prototype concept into a crucible of fire, a brutal testing ground that would validate its revised doctrine, expose its raw vulnerabilities, and set the pattern for its future evolution. This period was a harsh, real-world audit of the Zerstorer philosophy reborn. The first operational units to receive the Ju-88C were not dedicated fighter groups, but long-range reconnaissance squadrons, specifically Aufklärungsgruppe 123. This assignment was logical. These units were already flying the Ju-88A and were familiar with its handling. More importantly, their unarmed reconnaissance aircraft were suffering devastating losses to British fighters during their deep penetration missions over the British Isles. The Ju-88C offered a solution, a reconnaissance aircraft that could fight back. Initially, these aircraft operated as armed escorts for their vulnerable, unarmed sister ships, the Ju-88D reconnaissance planes. This was a low-risk, high-value introduction to combat, allowing crews to acclimatize to their new aircraft's fighting capabilities without being thrust immediately into the maelstrom of massed aerial combat. However, the escalating intensity of the Battle of Britain soon demanded a more aggressive role. By August 1940, the Luftwaffe was launching massive daily assaults on RAF airfields, radar stations, and infrastructure. The bomber formations, comprised of He-111s, Ju-17s, and Ju-88s, were being savaged. The Bf-110 had proven to be a failure as a close escort, and the Bf-109's range limitations created a critical fighter gap over the targets. It was into this desperate tactical void that the Ju-88C was pushed. Its first major test in the heavy fighter role was as an integrated escort, flying within the bomber streams. The theory was that its concentrated forward firepower would create a moving fortress effect. The reality over the Kentish and Sussex skies was a brutal shock. While the Ju-88C's armament was indeed formidable, the tactical environment was far more chaotic than anticipated. RAF fighters, particularly the Spitfires of No. 11 Group, rarely made the textbook head-on attacks that played to the Ju-88C's strengths. Instead, they exploited their superior climb rate and maneuverability to make diving, slashing attacks from above and behind, or from the beam, often targeting the bombers and ignoring the escorts until they had broken up the formation. In this chaotic melee, the Ju-88C's limitations became starkly apparent. This poor maneuverability made it impossible to stay with a Spitfire or Hurricane through a turning engagement. A pilot attempting to turn with a British fighter would quickly find himself outmaneuvered, with the enemy sliding onto his tail. The single, lightly served rear gun was a negligible deterrent to a determined attack. The aircraft's considerable weight and size made it an easier target to spot and hit than a single-engine fighter. Most critically, the restricted forward visibility from the solid nose proved to be a severe handicap in the fluid, visual-centric combat of 1940. Enemy fighters could disappear into the blind spots and launch an attack from an unseen quadrant. Losses were inevitable. The Ju-88C was not the invincible Zerstorer its proponents may have hoped. It was vulnerable, and its crews quickly learned that survival depended on strict adherence to a disciplined, energy-based doctrine. They could not play the enemy's game. They learned to use their speed in a straight line to extend away from a fight. They practiced the boom and zoom tactic, using a height advantage to make a high-speed, diving pass, unleashing a devastating burst of cannon and machine gun fire, and then using the accumulated speed to climb back to safety, never allowing the engagement to devolve into a turning contest. When flying as escort, they had to maintain strict formation discipline, relying on mutually supporting fire with other Ju-88CS and the bomber's own defensive guns. Despite the challenges, there were successes that pointed towards its more viable future roles. The aircraft proved exceptionally effective in the Jabo, fighter bomber, and anti-shipping roles. Its speed and ruggedness made it a dangerous low-level attacker against coastal targets, shipping convoys, and airfields. Armed with bombs and its nose cannon, a flight of Ju-88CS could make a swift, devastating strike and use its speed to escape before fighters could intercept. It was in these hit-and-run attacks that the aircraft's blend of bomber heritage and fighter armament found a truly effective expression. Furthermore, the very stability that hampered it in a dogfight made it a superb gun platform for strafing attacks. Its ability to absorb punishment meant it could fly through light flak and small arms fire during low-level attacks and still return to base. These early combat experiences began to subtly redefine the aircraft's primary value. While it had been created to solve the escort fighter problem, it was proving to be more of a multi-role attack aircraft and a potent intruder. The crucible of combat over England in 1940–41 thus provided a definitive, if sobering, answer. The Ju-88C was not the weapon that would win the Battle of Britain or establish daylight air superiority. It was too vulnerable in sustained aerial combat against modern single-engine fighters. However, it was far from a failure. It had proven its ruggedness, its formidable firepower, and its versatility. The early deployment taught the Luftwaffe how to use it and, more importantly, how not to use it. It was an aircraft that demanded specific tactics and specific missions. This hard-won combat knowledge would steer its development away from the doomed dream of a daytime Zerstörer and towards the roles where it would achieve its greatest and most feared success. As a night fighter, a long-range intruder, and a relentless hunter in the darkness. The fire of combat had burned away the doctrinal impurities, leaving behind a hardened, specialized, and ultimately more effective weapon. The early, bloody encounters over the English Channel and the British coastline served as a brutal but invaluable finishing school for the Junkers Ju-88C. The rigid pre-war theories of the Zerstörer were quickly discarded, replaced by a set of hard-won, pragmatic doctrines forged in the furnace of combat. The aircraft, as it existed in 1940, was a solution in search of a problem. The frontline experience definitively identified what those problems were, and in doing so initiated a rapid and critical tactical evolution. This was not an evolution of the airframe itself, but of the minds of the men who flew it, an adaptation of strategy and technique that would ultimately secure the type a lasting and fearsome reputation. The first and most painful lesson was the absolute imperative to avoid turning combat. The high loss rates in early engagements where pilots attempted to dogfight with Spitfires and Hurricanes made it abundantly clear that this was a path to certain destruction. The Ju-88C's weight, wide turning radius, and sluggish roll rate were insurmountable handicaps in a close-in knife fight. This fundamental limitation forced a complete reevaluation of its engagement protocol. The concept of the slashing, high-speed pass, the boom and zoom attack, was elevated from a suggested tactic to a core tenet of survival. Pilots learned to cherish their energy state above all else. They would use altitude, their one convertible asset, to build up speed in a dive, make a single, devastating firing pass on an enemy formation or a lone aircraft, and then use that kinetic energy to climb away, never looking back and never, ever turning to re-engage if it meant sacrificing their speed advantage. This hit-and-run philosophy was the antithesis of the dogfighting ethos, but for the Ju-88C it was the key to life. This energy-based doctrine necessitated a new form of marksmanship. With only a fleeting second or two to acquire the target, aim, and fire during a high-speed pass, pilots had to make every round count. The mixed armament of cannon and machine guns was used to its full effect. The tracer rounds from the MG-17 machine guns were often used to walk the fire onto the target, with the pilot then keying the 20mm MGFF cannon for the killing burst. This required immense discipline, as the 20mm ammunition supply was limited. The stable gun platform of the Ju-88C was a significant advantage here, allowing for a concentrated burst even at high closing speeds. This transformed the aircraft from a brawler into a sniper, relying on a single, well-aimed shot rather than a sustained exchange of fire. The second major lesson concerned the aircraft's role within larger formations. The initial idea of integrating Ju-88Cs as flying fortresses within the bomber stream was only partially successful. While their presence added considerable defensive firepower, they also made the formation more predictable and, as larger targets, could attract enemy attention. The evolution was towards more flexible escort tactics. Instead of being locked into the center of the bomber box, Ju-88C swarm flights of 4 aircraft began operating on the flanks of the formation and, most effectively, flying a top cover position several thousand feet above the bombers. This altitude gave them the potential energy needed for their diving attacks and provided a better vantage point to spot incoming enemy fighters before they struck. From this position, they could pounce on enemy formations as they assembled for their attack, disrupting their coordination before they could even reach the bombers. Perhaps the most significant tactical evolution was the shift away from the contested daylight skies towards the opportunities presented by darkness and poor weather. The Ju-88C's vulnerabilities, poor visibility and lack of maneuverability, were nullified at night. Its strengths, long endurance, stable flight characteristics, a roomy cockpit for a second crewman, and heavy firepower became paramount. The early, improvised night fighting efforts, often directed by searchlights or ground control, revealed the aircraft's immense potential in this role. Pilots developed rudimentary night interception tactics, learning to use the cover of darkness to stalk their prey visually, often approaching from below where the black shape of the Ju-88C was hardest to see against the dark ground. This led directly to the development of the dedicated night fighter, a role for which the Ju-88C and its successors would become legendary. The airframe's capacity to carry the weight and bulk of early radar sets, like the FUG-202 Liechtenstein, without a catastrophic performance loss was a game-changer. This technological marriage necessitated a new tactical evolution, the shift from a single-pilot fighter to a two-man weapons system. The pilot was now part of a team with a dedicated radar operator, Bordfunker, who guided them to the target using his electronic screens. This required entirely new skills and coordination, a far cry from the visual daytime fighting for which the aircraft was originally intended. The tactics evolved from visual slashing attacks to carefully managed, radar-directed intercepts, often culminating in an attack from directly below the enemy bomber, where its defensive guns were blind. Furthermore, the lessons of survivability led to the formalization of the Storkampf intruder mission. The Ju-88C's range and punch made it ideal for lone wolf operations over enemy territory, hunting bombers over their own airfields, attacking railway junctions, and sowing disruption far behind the front lines. Here, tactics emphasized navigation, stealth, and individual initiative. Pilots became masters of using terrain masking and weather fronts to avoid interception, striking with surprise and then vanishing back into the night. In conclusion, the frontline experience did not change the Ju-88C's hardware as much as it rewrote its software. The tactical evolution was a journey from a misplaced faith in a multi-role daytime destroyer to a sophisticated understanding of a specialized platform. The pilots and commanders learned to weaponize its strengths, firepower, endurance, and stability, while systematically avoiding scenarios that highlighted its weaknesses. They transformed it from a reluctant daytime escort into a master of the night, a patient hunter, and a ruthless intruder. The aircraft that entered service in 1940 and the one that dominated the night skies in 1943 were, in many ways, the same machine. The profound difference lay in the hard-learned, blood-soaked lessons that had forged a new and deadly way to wage war from its cockpit. The Junkers Ju-88C V1 was far more than a solitary prototype. It was the progenitor of an entire lineage, the seed from which grew one of the most versatile and extensively developed weapon systems of the Second World War. Its successful proof of concept, that the basic Ju-88 airframe could be effectively weaponized as a heavy fighter, unlocked a torrent of development that would see the type evolve far beyond its initial role. The legacy of the Ju-88C is not confined to its own combat record, but is etched into the DNA of its prolific progeny, which dominated the night skies, hunted shipping lanes, and pushed the boundaries of aerial warfare technology until the final days of the conflict. The direct lineage began with the initial production models, the Ju-88C2 and C4. These were essentially refined versions of the V1 prototype, built on the A1 and A4 bomber airframes respectively, and armed with the now standard battery of 120mm MGFF cannon and three 7.92mm MG17 machine guns in the solid nose. They solidified the aircraft's multi-role identity, serving as heavy escorts, bomber destroyers, and formidable Jabo, fighter-bomber aircraft. However, it was the subsequent models, responding to the harsh lessons of the frontline, that truly defined the family's legacy. The most significant and feared offspring was the dedicated night fighter series, beginning with the Ju-88C6B and exploding into the purpose-built Ju-88G series. This evolution was a direct result of the tactical shift from doomed daylight operations to the nocturnal battlefield. The G model was a quantum leap. It was powered by the vastly superior 1,700 horsepower BMW 801 radial engines, which finally provided the performance needed to catch the RAF's heavy bombers. Its airframe was cleaned up, and it featured a new, larger vertical tail from the Ju-188 to improve stability at high altitudes, a critical factor for night fighting. Most importantly, it was designed from the outset to integrate the increasingly sophisticated radar systems that turned the night into a German ally. The Ju-88G became the platform for the Schrägmusik, jazz music, offensive armament. Upward-firing 20mm cannons mounted in the rear fuselage. This revolutionary tactic allowed the night fighter to approach unseen from below, where the British bomber's ventral gun turret was absent, and unleash a devastating volley into the enemy's full wings and fuel tanks. The Ju-88G, with its advanced radar like the FUG-220 Liechtenstein SN2 and FUG-228 Flensburg, became the apex predator of the NAC-JAGD night fighter force, accounting for thousands of Allied aircraft and forcing a continual technological and tactical arms race with Bomber Command. Alongside the night fighter evolution ran the development of the Zerstorer and anti-shipping variants. The Ju-88C6A and later the Ju-88P series took the concept of heavy firepower to its logical extreme. The Ju-88P1 was a dedicated tank buster and ground attack aircraft, armed with a massive pod-mounted 75mm Bordkanone BK-7, 5 cannon under the fuselage, one of the largest weapons ever fitted to a twin-engine aircraft. While cumbersome and vulnerable, it demonstrated the airframe's incredible ability to handle immense firepower. The P2 variant swapped this for a 50mm BK-5 cannon, offering a higher rate of fire against both ground and maritime targets. In the anti-shipping role, particularly over the treacherous Arctic convoys to the Soviet Union, the Ju-88C and its derivatives, often armed with underwing rockets and bombs in addition to their nose cannon, proved to be a persistent and deadly threat to Allied shipping. The legacy of the Ju-88C also extended into the realm of electronic warfare and special operations. The airframe's spacious fuselage made it an ideal platform for electronic countermeasures, ECM, equipment. Variants like the Ju-88C6A were modified as Vernachjager, long-range night fighters, and Pathfinders, equipped with devices to jam Allied radar and navigational systems. Other versions were used in the Wild Sow, Wild Boar, freelance night fighting tactic, where single-engine fighters relied on the illumination from target flares and searchlights, sometimes dropped by Ju-88s to find their prey. The ultimate testament to the soundness of the original Ju-88 design was its continuous development into the war's final years. The Ju-188 and Ju-388 were direct, evolved descendants, featuring pressurized cabins, more powerful engines, and even more advanced radar and weapon systems. The Ju-388, in particular, was designed as a high-altitude interceptor and reconnaissance aircraft, a far cry from the medium-altitude bomber its ancestor had been, yet sharing the same fundamental genetic code. The legacy of the Ju-88C V1 is therefore one of profound and sustained adaptability. It began as a stopgap solution to a tactical emergency, but the inherent robustness and versatility of the design allowed it to become a cornerstone of the Luftwaffe's operational capability for the entire war. It spawned a family of aircraft that excelled in roles their designers could never have originally envisioned. As radar-equipped night hunters, as tank busters armed with artillery pieces, and as electronic warfare platforms. Its progeny dominated the night, terrorized shipping lanes, and forced continual innovation upon the Allies. The Ju-88C was not merely an aircraft. It was a platform, a philosophy of modular, adaptable warfare made manifest in metal and fire. Its true success lay not in perfecting the heavy fighter of 1940, but in providing the foundational template for a family of specialized warriors that remained relevant and dangerous until the very end. In the grand, sweeping narratives of World War II aviation, certain aircraft claim the spotlight with an undeniable, iconic presence. The Spitfire, symbol of defiance, the Mustang, embodiment of long-range liberation, the Messerschmitt Bf-109, the ubiquitous and deadly foe. The Junkers Ju-88C, by contrast, does not occupy such a pedestal. It is not the star of the show, but rather a critical character actor, its significance woven into the complex, often darker tapestry of the air war. Its place in aviation history is that of a highly influential footnote, a design whose true impact was not in revolutionizing fighter combat, but in demonstrating the power of adaptability and in forging a new, terrifying form of aerial warfare that flourished in the shadows. The Ju-88C was, first and foremost, a testament to the power of the airframe concept. Its story is one of pragmatic evolution over revolutionary design. In an era where aircraft were often designed for a single, specific purpose, the Ju-88 stood apart. Its original blueprint possessed an inherent robustness, speed, and volumetric capacity that made it uniquely suited for roles far beyond its initial remit as a bomber. The Ju-88C was the ultimate expression of this philosophy. It proved that a successful military aircraft could be a platform, a blank canvas upon which the ever-shifting demands of war could paint new capabilities. This legacy of multi-role adaptability would become a central tenet of post-war military aircraft design, seen in everything from the F-4 Phantom to the F-15 Eagle. The Ju-88 taught the lesson that strategic utility could be found not only in specialized perfection but also in versatile potential. However, its historical place is cemented not by its daytime exploits, but by its mastery of the night. As a daytime Zerstörer, the Ju-88C was an unequivocal failure in its original doctrinal goal. It could not win air superiority against modern single-engine fighters, and its attempt to solve the escort problem was a tactical dead end. Yet, this very failure became the catalyst for its greatest success. Forced from the sunlit skies, it found its true calling in the darkness. The Ju-88C and its G-series progeny became the backbone of the NACJAGD, the most sophisticated and lethal night air defense force of its time. In this role, it was not a compromised bomber but a purpose-evolved hunter. Its stable flight characteristics were perfect for the precise flying required for radar-directed intercepts. Its spacious airframe accommodated the radar operator and his complex, bulky equipment. Its ruggedness allowed it to withstand the inevitable collisions with the flak-filled night sky and the debris from its own victims. This transformation established a new paradigm for aerial combat. The Ju-88G, with its Schrage music cannon, was not merely a fighter operating at night. It was a component in a fully integrated weapons system. It relied on ground-controlled interception, GCI, airborne radar, and electronic countermeasures in a complex, technology-driven dance of death. This shift from the individualistic knight of the air to the crew-served, electronically augmented hunter was a profound change. The Ju-88 was the vessel that carried this concept to its highest state of development in the war, setting the stage for the post-war jet-powered interceptors that would rely entirely on radar and missiles. This place is also defined by its role as a catalyst for Allied innovation. The devastating effectiveness of the NACJAGD, spearheaded by the Ju-88, forced the RAF's bomber command into a relentless technological race. To counter the Liechtenstein radar, the British developed window chaff. To counter the Schrage music attacks, they modified their bombers with ventral gun turrets and experimented with radar warning devices. The entire electronic warfare (EW) ecosystem, jammers, homers, and counterjammers, evolved at a breakneck pace in direct response to the threat posed by this German night fighter. The Ju-88, therefore, was not just a recipient of technological advancement. It was a driver of it, accelerating the development of electronic warfare on both sides and forever changing the nature of strategic bombing. Yet, its legacy is also one of ambiguity and shadow. Unlike the clean lines of a dogfight over the English Channel, the night war was a brutal, impersonal affair. The Ju-88's successes came from ambush and electronic advantage, its victims often dying without ever seeing their attacker. It was a weapon of defense that, in its intruder role, became one of terror for Allied aircrews over their own bases. It lacks the romantic, chivalrous aura sometimes ascribed to the fighters of the Battle of Britain. Its history is one of grim efficiency, a necessary tool in a war of attrition that grew increasingly desperate and brutal. In the final analysis, to relegate the Ju-88C to a mere footnote is not to diminish its importance, but to accurately categorize its influence. It was not an aircraft that defined a battle in the public consciousness, but one that defined a type of warfare. It stands as a monument to engineering pragmatism, a design whose inherent virtues were so potent that they allowed it to pivot from a failed doctrine to a dominant one. Its place in aviation history is secure not as a glorious champion, but as the dark prince of the night, a relentless and sophisticated hunter whose very existence shaped the technology, tactics, and terrifying character of the nocturnal air war. It is the footnote that, upon closer reading, reveals itself to be the key to understanding an entire chapter of aerial conflict. The journey of the Junkers Ju-88C V1, from its genesis as a tactical stopgap to its legacy as the progenitor of a legendary family of warplanes, represents a narrative far more profound than the sum of its individual combat sorties. Its enduring impact is not measured solely in the aircraft it shot down or the missions it flew, but in the indelible mark it left on the philosophy of aircraft design, the evolution of aerial warfare, and the very template for military adaptation under the relentless pressure of total war. The Ju-88C V1 was more than a prototype. It was a paradigm, a proof of concept that demonstrated how inherent design virtue could be harnessed and redirected to meet the unforeseen and brutal demands of a conflict that constantly defied pre-war doctrine. The most immediate and tangible impact of the Ju-88C V1 was its validation of the platform concept. In an era where aircraft were increasingly specialized, the Ju-88 stood as a powerful argument for inherent versatility. Its airframe, blessed with a rare combination of speed, structural strength, and volumetric capacity, was revealed as a national asset of immense strategic value. The successful conversion of the V-1 proved that the Junkers bomber was not a finished product, but a foundational chassis. This realization unlocked a torrent of innovation, saving the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, RLM, the years and resources required to design, test, and tool up for entirely new aircraft to fulfill new roles. The Ju-88C was the key that opened the door to the night-fighting Ju-88G, the tank-busting Ju-88P, and the high-altitude Ju-388. Its impact was the creation of an entire ecosystem of air power from a single, brilliant core design, a lesson in strategic efficiency that would resonate through the Cold War and into the modern era. Beyond the physical airframes, the prototype's legacy is etched into the tactical and technological landscape of modern combat. The Ju-88C's forced evolution from a failed daytime Zerstorer into the master of the night sky marked a pivotal shift in the nature of aerial engagement. It was the primary vehicle for the transition from visual, dogfighting-based combat to electronic, system-based warfare. The marriage of the Ju-88 airframe with airborne radar and centralized ground control created the world's first integrated air defense network. This was not merely an improvement in technique. It was a revolution. The pilot was no longer a lone knight but the leader of a crew, a component in a complex human-machine system. The development of Schrage-Music tactics, perfected in the Ju-88's fuselage, introduced a new geometry of attack that rendered existing bomber defensive schemes obsolete. In this, the Ju-88C's impact was to elevate air combat from a contest of aerodynamics and marksmanship to a struggle of sensors, electronics, and systemic intellect. Furthermore, the aircraft story is a timeless case study in tactical adaptation. The initial failure of the heavy fighter concept in the daylight skies over Britain could have consigned the Ju-88C to the scrap heap of history as another flawed German wonder weapon. Instead, it became a spectacular success because its operators, the engineers, the commanders, and the aircrews, possessed the flexibility to learn and adapt. They discarded a flawed doctrine not by abandoning the hardware, but by reimagining its application. They looked at the aircraft's weaknesses, its poor daytime visibility and maneuverability, and recognized that these were irrelevant in the darkness. They saw its strengths, endurance, stability, and payload capacity, and weaponized them for a new kind of battle. This process of learning, pivoting, and specializing under fire is a universal military principle, and the Ju-88C remains one of its most compelling historical exemplars. The prototype's impact also extends into the realm of its adversaries. The sheer effectiveness of the Ju-88-based NAC-JAGD force acted as a powerful and brutal catalyst for Allied innovation. The entire electronic warfare arms race, the development of window, chaff to blind German radar, the introduction of Serrate and Boozer homing devices, the desperate search for countermeasures against Schrage-Music, was accelerated by the looming threat of the Ju-88G in the night sky. In a very real sense, the advanced radar and electronic countermeasures that became standard on post-war aircraft owe their rapid wartime development to the need to survive an encounter with this formidable hunter. The Ju-88C, therefore, did not just influence German tactics. It directly shaped the technological trajectory of the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces, driving them into the electronic age. In conclusion, the Junkers Ju-88C V1's enduring impact transcends its metal and wire. It stands as a monument to the power of adaptable design, a bridge between the rigid doctrines of the 1930s and the complex, systemic warfare of the modern age. It taught the lesson that a platform's potential is limited only by the imagination of its users. From its solid nose first conceived in 1939 sprouted a family of aircraft that defined the nocturnal air war, challenged Allied technological supremacy, and demonstrated a breathtaking capacity for reinvention. It was not the most beautiful aircraft, nor the most famous, but its story is perhaps more instructive than any other. It is the story of how a machine, born of necessity and forged in the crucible of combat, evolved to leave a legacy that forever changed the way wars are fought in the air. The Ju-88C V1 was not merely a prototype. It was a prophecy of warfare's future, written in fire across the darkened skies of Europe.